Within all competitive environments, whether that's business, sports, games, or anything in between, there will always be a group of people who are considered to be the best at what they do. Now, I don't know anything about baseball, but I do know that Babe Ruth is one of the best players to ever grace the game. World of Warcraft is no exception. And while you may not know the names of the top players, their ability to perform within the various classes, specializations, and roles are equally as impressive, destroying difficult bosses or even saving the entire raid from impending doom. Most players within World of Warcraft will not be the best of players that have ever graced the game. Most people won't be the Babe Ruth of DPS. But what if we got close? What if we had some sort of cheat sheet? A way not only to see what the top players were doing, but tools to diagnose how they were accomplishing it. A sort of crystal ball to give us all of their secrets so that we could mirror their motions, their timings, their abilities, so that we too could perform at that same level. Luckily, this doesn't have to be a hypothetical situation because it's real, and we do have those tools. Warcraft Logs records every single spell cast in order, in a moment-by-moment replication of every player's actions within an encounter. Warcraft Logs, when leveraged correctly, can let you stand on the shoulders of giants and improve our overall raid performance. No more guesswork, no more, oh well if only my team better, I'd parse better. No, today we'll be casting aside those excuses and looking at how to become better players by auditing the top performers of the entire game. Hi folks, welcome in. I'm Hrothmar. My goal is to help make World of Warcraft more accessible to everybody. I've put a lot of time into this game and I'm hoping that others enjoy it as well. This guide is part 3 in a series of me covering Warcraft Logs. The previous 2 videos in this series covered an overview of how to use the tool as an entirety and how to identify individual areas of self-improvement respectively. This guide will instead be focused on how to look at worldwide top performances, identifying common builds per boss, and how to learn fights before ever stepping foot into them. There are no prerequisites for this video, as it will act as a standalone way of auditing the top performers in the world to cleave insights from their already existing logs. I would recommend pulling up a separate browser tab and opening warcraftlogs.com so that you can follow along as we explore these logs, but it's not necessary. The content that you may see in this video will likely change from what you see when you pull this up on the live website, depending on when you're seeing this guide, but the core ideas and methods will remain consistent. In order to begin our auditing journey, we'll begin by learning how to navigate overall rankings. To begin, head on over to warcraftlogs.com. To navigate overall rankings, we'll turn our attention to the upper left-hand corners of the Warcraft Logs user interface. Specifically, we're looking at the drop-downs here which say Raids, Dungeons, and Raid Guides. Most of your time will be spent in the Raid section, with the Dungeon section almost never being used since they rarely contain logs, and the Raid Guide section being a new tool leveraged for learning raid mechanics with visual guides. That said, we'll be spending most of our time in the Raids dropdown, so let's turn our attention back to this one specifically. Within the dropdown, the navigation breaks down further into the ability to look at a specific expansion, and then overall raid tiers, and finally individual bosses within that raid tier. Looking at the overall raid tier data is not particularly useful in my opinion, but it does have use cases for people like raid leaders who want to know how to contextualize classes and specs against each other as a whole. On the other hand, looking at the data from the individual boss's perspective is incredibly useful, and this is where the bulk of this guide will be focused. Since we'll be primarily focused on auditing individual boss logs, let's look at how each of these work. Within each individual boss section, there'll be 4 items to choose from within the boss itself. The first option is Rankings. Rankings is the most important button here and the only one to remember. It shows us the top performances across all players in the world within the selected encounter. This is where you're going to spend 99% of your time, and the bulk of what this guide will be focused on. Statistics is good for a bird's eye view of how specs compare against each other for different fights. It's not super useful for identifying other than roughly how your class should be performing and how it compares to other classes. For example, this is what Aranog's boss fight looks like. The next 2 options, Progress and All Reports, are quite frankly not very useful, nor are they frequently ever used. Progress is used to see a world first race breakdown to show who beat that boss first and how they did it. And the All Reports option is a list that shows literally every single report that was ever uploaded for that boss. we can safely ignore these two options. So for all intents and purposes, let's just keep our focus on the first two, rankings and statistics, with almost all the attention focused on rankings. Next, let's cover how to look at a top rank for a specific boss. To do this, we're going to choose the raid drop-down menu, and then we'll find which boss that we want to look at the audits from. For example, let's choose Dathia Ascended, and then we'll go to the rankings button within it. Once the page loads, we'll be met with all of the top logs in the entire world for this boss. By default, you'll be looking at the top overall damage logs on Mythic across all characters, all classes, all specs, and no matter who that damage was done to. This view isn't terribly useful auditing information just yet, so let's go ahead and adjust some of the filters at the top of the page to give us an even more powerful data set to use. The first filter that we have is the metrics section. By default, it will read as damage, but we can filter this by a number of different options here to view the different information within it. You'll notice that it's broken down into three major sections: guild, character, and damage to boss. The top section, which has guilds listed on the right, is not used very often, but can be useful if I want to see something like who has killed the boss the fastest, which is the speed option. The second overall section here is more frequently used. It's used to scope at individual performance. Here you can swap between looking at things like damage and healing parses, depending on your role. The final section, damage to boss, can be incredibly useful depending on your job within the raid. For example, on fights like Dathia Ascended, there are two major teams, one that always damages the boss, and one that runs off and does a bunch of damage to adds, then returns back to the boss. If you are a raider and you're on boss duty, so you're solely attacking the boss while other people get to run off and handle the adds, it can make it very difficult to look through the logs for auditing, since comparing yourself to other players might result in them doing adds versus you who is just doing the boss, making them not a good match to look against. With the damage to boss filter, you can filter down and see just the top performers for the highest throughput into only the boss itself. We can do that now on this page, and you'll see that the top parses go from being anywhere from 108 to about 110k DPS down to about 109 to around 101k DPS instead. So if you were a raider on boss duty, your expectation for performance can shift greatly just by filtering properly. For now, let's go back to looking at just damage, which includes both damage to the boss and adds together. The next filter that we have access to is the boss filter. This option lets us keep the same filters that we have applied everywhere, but swap which boss that we're currently looking at within the raid. Not a lot of explanation is needed here, but just know that if you want to keep the other filters that you already have applied, but want to look at a different boss, this is how you can do that on the fly. The third filter is the difficulty filter, and this is also pretty self-explanatory. Always be sure to look at the difficulty you're currently operating within, since boss mechanics and strategies can change wildly depending on the difficulty that you're running the boss on. If you are working on a heroic boss with your guild, do not use builds that you've seen from the mythic parses or vice versa. Always be sure to filter to the correct content that you're actively trying to improve within. If you're on heroic with your team, be sure to look at only heroic bosses. The fourth section is regions. Regions let you view logs from different areas across the globe. Generally speaking, I'd highly recommend you just keep this set to all regions. Just be aware that logs are run using the native language of the region that they're being run within, meaning you can get other languages appearing in your logs. For example, if I click into this Korean log, all of the spells and abilities and boss names, etc. will be set in Korean. So if I click into this monk, all their spell names will be in Korean except for, I guess, melee, which is in English. You can still cleave very important information out of these logs if you have the patience to translate it. But if you don't want this appearing, you can change the region filter to only include regions that you're currently in for a higher chance of the logs being readable to you. The fifth filter, all classes, is extremely important. Namely, because you can look at the exact class and specialization that you're actively wanting to find very direct information from, and set realistic expectations for your performance within your class and spec. For example, if you're playing an arms warrior, you really shouldn't care how much an unholy death knight is doing damage-wise, because you'll never be able to play an unholy death knight when you're an arms warrior. There's some other added benefits as well, like showing an aggregate talent build and a better defined performance set of expectations, both of which we'll dive into in the future. The next filter, Factions, is safe to keep as all factions, especially with cross-faction raids and guilds becoming baseline after patch 10.1. That said, you can filter to see the factions if you are curious about how you sit within your faction, if that matters to you anymore, but just as a rough spoiler, it really shouldn't matter and don't use this, it's irrelevant. There's also a filter here for item level. You can set item level ranges, which are roughly every 2 item levels it looks like based on this chart. I really would, I would heavily suggest it against ever touching this because item level is just really not a good tool for auditing performance ever. There's too many factors that go into this. In a nutshell, you could have different trinkets, different weapons, different etc. So while, they have the same item level as me, they're going to perform wildly different than you do unless you have the exact same gear that they do, and not just the item level. So just roughly speaking, never ever look at this. This is also irrelevant. Next up is the patch filter. The patch information shown here will change based on the current patch that the game is in right now. Currently, I'm recording this game in patch 10.0.7, so that's what the default's going to be for me at this point in time. This will likely look much different if you're viewing this video after any time in April of 2023, so just be aware of that. Just know that anytime a major rework of classes or a major patch comes out, it's a good idea to check the patch filter so that you're only viewing the most up-to-date version. That way you're looking at things like relevant data for the current way that your class is being played. You don't really want to look at old parses, just in case there's buffs or nerfs that went out, which means that that data is no longer relevant for auditing. Finally is the external buffs dropdown. The external buffs dropdown is for benefits such as power infusion or other sort of external class-given buffs, which may skew the player performance greatly depending on the class that you play. As a note, at the time of me recording this video, Warcraft logs currently disqualify logs that get too many external buffs within too short of a period of time to prevent sort of parse skewing. Generally speaking, if it bothers you that someone else might be getting power infusion and you aren't, you can use this filter to remove parses where someone got that buff so that you can more directly match your individual situation as long as you want to. Okay, so now that we've covered the UI and what the various filters do, let's dig into the real meat and potatoes of this guide, which is how to audit top logs. I'm going to break this next section down into a few different subsections of common use cases for when you may want to audit top logs of information based on community feedback about auditing in general. To begin, let's see how to identify different talent builds within logs to see what options exist for your class if you want to perform well. Warcraft Logs has a new feature that consolidates build information across the top 100 logs for any class or specialization so that you can view an aggregated build of what is most likely to be taken talent-wise for a specific fight. To do this, you first need to look at an individual boss encounter, as well as filter to a specific class and a specific sub-specialization. It's also a very good idea to set the correct difficulty that you'll be participating in, since these fights can wildly change between normal, heroic, and mythic with new mechanics to be aware of, and therefore different build options. Let's go ahead and do this now. Let's set our filters to look at damage, Aranog, mythic, and arms warriors. We already have our metrics filter set to damage, and let's change our boss fight to Aranog. We'll confirm that the difficulty is set to mythic, and once the page loads, we'll be able to use this classes dropdown to select warrior and arms warrior. Once you have the class and spec selected, an aggregate talent build will appear on the screen. At the top of the screen, you'll see a new section that appears called the Top 100 Breakdown. Within this, there's a most used talents, top trinkets for the fight, common crafted gear, called embellishments here, or any sort of other relevant build information. If we expand the most used talent sections by clicking on this Show More button, you'll be met with a heat map of where players are allocating their talent points. If something has higher than 95% chosen, it will show in pink because it's likely a very good idea to take, with more flexible points showing up as green, blue, or purple with growing percent of players taking them. If a talent option contains a choice node, you'll see that it has left and right arrows on them, and hovering atop them will show which one of the options are taken and their percent breakdown to help you get further information to get a build together quickly. Looking over this Aranog build, it's apparent that most of the build is pretty set in stone. There's a few flexible points existing where you can optionally take barbaric training or honed reflexes on the warrior side of the tree, and there appears to be an optional point between bloodborne and accelerating blows on the arm side. A good example of a talent tree with a little bit more choice happening would be on fights such as Broodkeeper. where we see a lot more point swapping happening, with 40% of the players going down the left side of the tree and 60% of the players going down the right half of the tree. We'd then want to identify which of these builds are used for which purpose, then ensure that they align with what our raid leader needs us to do, which will boil down to the class and fight knowledge. But the overview here helps us to identify builds from a bird's eye view. Next, let's talk about setting performance expectations. Since we can see that there's a variety of different builds happening, and DPS performance will change from class to class, it's healthy to use top logs in a way that creates an achievable goal for yourself when working on killing a boss. While you should not expect to top parse on your initial progression kill, using logs to help inform your performance can ensure a smoother, better progression overall, in turn leading to a better parse with practice. Let's keep looking at Broodkeeper here for now, because this fight I know has two very different builds, and I want to cover how to audit both of these. To do this, we can go ahead and collapse the most used talent sections by clicking on Show Less. And we'll be taking a look at the rank section below, specifically on the DPS column. At this time, we can see that the top player in the world was able to pull 147,000 DPS. It's reasonable to say that that's a pretty unrealistic goal, because as we scan our eyes downwards, we can see that by the time we reach the top 15, we've already dropped 15,000 DPS, or roughly 10% of the top parse. So we should not set our expectations based on the topmost log, since they likely had circumstances or a performance which is uncommon for the fight. Instead, we can scroll downwards to get a feel for roughly the damage spread happening within the top 100 parses of the fight, which range from 147 at number 1 down to about 109k, with most of them landing in roughly the 112 to 115k range. Personally, I do not set a DPS goal for myself, but I like to be roughly aware of what is theoretically possible for my spec so that I know how high I could potentially achieve. I next wanted to cover how to audit the difference between multiple talent builds within a single boss fight, both how to identify them and how to see their performance differences. Scrolling through for the Aranog fight, we can see that there's not a lot of variation happening, and in fact, every single one of these logs looks to be using the same talents. If we come to a fight that has a little bit more variation on it, such as returning back over here to Broodkeeper, we can see that some of the fights are taking Juggernaut, which is this little icon of a guy running, while others are not. This is important because another note that I wanted to touch on is how Broodkeeper is an example of one of many bosses that you may encounter where your raid team will likely be broken into a trash group and a boss group. At the time that this video was made, Bladestorm is not a great spell to use when you want to do damage to the boss, meaning that almost all of these logs, which all contain Bladestorm, likely mean that the top logs are all coming from people who were assisting in the trash group, which skews their parses quite high. For the sake of this video, let's say that you're not allowed to join the trash team and you've been assigned to boss duty, and you're not allowed to go play with all the other players of your spec that are the top of the meters. In order to set a better expectation of what our performance will look like, we'll go up to the metrics filter and change from damage to damage to bosses. Now before we click this, let's look at this top DPS again. We're going from about 147k to around 115k DPS for nearly all of these fights, right? Now, if we come over here and we look at damage to boss, the DPS ceiling for single target arms warriors is going to plummet dramatically. For example, the top player at this time is doing 96,000 damage, with a steep fall off to reaching 80k and even reaching down into the 70ks before we hit the top 100. This will update our most used talent section, and we'll see that this is actually incredibly consistent compared to what we were looking at in the overall breakdown. So if you were doing a single target, I'm on boss duty build, you'd likely want to be using this one. This means if you're an arms warrior and you're on boss duty, do not expect to pull around the 110 to 140k DPS that we saw from the trash group, and better align your personal expectations and those of your raid leader with what you should be performing within the boss team. Okay, now that we've talked about some of the common areas for general DPS expectations and talents to use, let's talk about how to audit DPS and cooldown use at a glance. As a note, I won't be going into in-depth detail on how to audit logs individually for this guide, since I cover this extensively on my other video for Warcraft logs, covering both the auditing of individual logs and how to compare them, both of which will be linked in the video description of this guide below. So the scope of what this video's auditing will be covering is how to identify quick information within the top logs at a glance. To do this, we'll take a few different approaches. The first of which is to look at a specific boss fight, correct difficulty, and for the boss/trash group that you're assigned to. Then we'll look at the topmost ranks that show up. We want to gain information from players who are able to use the highest amount of damage possible to learn from those who are able to perform better than we did. A good example of this would be Mythic Dathia. We'll go ahead and go to the Raids dropdown and visit Dathia Ascended rankings. Much like Broodkeeper, Dathia has two teams, but there is only one set of ads that need to get annihilated by a team before returning to the boss and continuing the burn. Let's also go ahead and filter to Arms Warriors. If we take a look at the top performers for this fight, we'll go ahead and choose Aroka's Parse for 108k. When we click into the log, we'll be met with a view of the overall DPS for the entire raid. Now to filter it further, let's go ahead and click specifically into Aroka's name here. As we can see, there is an absolutely tremendous spike in damage right around the 130 mark, reaching upwards into the 450k DPS range. This to me is a great indicator that if we were going to be doing a Mythic Dathia attempt within our own raid, we should maybe look to see what happens around 1 minute and 30 seconds, and plan some cooldowns around it. Auditing cooldowns is something I go more in depth in my other videos for analyzing individual logs. But to quickly touch on it, let's go ahead and go to the cast section and change our view from tables to timelines. In a nutshell, this is a list of every ability cast in the order that it was cast throughout the fight. Again, I go into more of this in depth in one of my previous videos, so just bear with me here and we'll audit this together. Something that we can see here initially is that they're not using their main stat potion on pull, instead opting to use their puzzle box, which is a 3-minute trinket that gives them a large secondary stat boost for 20 seconds. We can also see that they're using their main cooldowns, Avatar and Thunderous Roar, both of which have 1.5 minute cooldowns immediately on pull. The rest of this rotation we can mostly ignore here, because we can scroll ahead to the 1 minute and 30 second mark, and we can see what happened leading up to that massive DPS increase. We can see this gap in casts what happens right here. This is them repositioning to reach the ads. They then use charge to close the distance, and here is where they use their main stat potion. They then follow it up with their major cooldowns again, Avatar, Thunderous Roar, and then go about performing an AoE rotation with Whirlwind and Sweeping Strikes to spread the damage into all the ads that they're attacking. It just so happens that Arms has a perfect cooldown duration for helping with trash, but an important takeaway here is that they did not use their potion on pull, and instead they used their potion on the platform. This is a great example of a key piece of information that you could discover, then keep in your back pocket for when you want to do your own attempts on this boss. Also, if we were allowed to do the trash pack just like this person has, we could check their talent build by coming here to the summary tab, and we'll see a talent breakdown listed right here. So if we wanted to have the exact same set of talents and therefore the same toolkit that this player did when we do our own attempt, you can find that information here, and you can even export it directly by clicking this button, and it will copy their entire talent loadout to your clipboard. You can then pull up World of Warcraft and import it directly. We've covered how to audit top logs, looking at the various builds that players could potentially be using, as well as how to differentiate them from the various teams assignment within a boss fight, and how to identify pitfalls and set expectations of your own individual performance. At this point, I would directly encourage you to attempt to audit your own class and your own specialization's top logs, to see what new information you can glean from them. It's also important to repeat this process often, since new builds, new knowledge, and new class changes can greatly impact how you perform well within a boss fight. With enough time and practice, you can cement your own name in the top logs for fights, and other players will be using you as a benchmark for their own performance possibilities. I hope that this video helped to outline some of the major areas to be aware of when it comes to auditing the top 100 within Warcraft logs. It can be incredibly useful to stand on the shoulders of giants and discover opportunities, builds, timings, and other things from other players who have already done the fight before you, which can lead to higher performance and faster boss killing within progression. If this guide helped you to become a better performer, even something as small as how to look at talent aggregates or filtering between damage and damage to boss, or HPS for my healing friends, please be sure to leave a like on the video so that others can find it as well. If you've enjoyed this guide but wish that I would cover a different topic that you've been yearning to learn about, please let me know in the comments below. And, as always, if you want to see more in-depth guides from me in the future, be sure to subscribe. Thank you so much for watching, And until next time, remember to play safe and be nice to your fellow players out there.